Isabel Neville held a pivotal role in the political struggles of her time, and through her parents, she was deeply connected to the Wars of the Roses. But she herself is a hugely forgotten woman, and she barely has a mention in the history books until her unfortunate and apparently deeply suspicious death. This video tries to piece together the little we know of Isabel, put her story in context, and discover what impact she really had, if any. She was one of the two daughters born into the powerful Neville family. Their father was Richard Neville, 16th Earl of Warwick, but only through his marriage to their mother, Anne Beauchamp. Isabel was born on the 5th of September 1451 in the imposing Warwick Castle, their family's stronghold, the elder sister to Anne, who would one day go on to become a very little-known Queen of England. Her parents had married while still children, and her mother had only inherited the Warwick family fortune by the unexpected death of her brother and his young daughter. But by the time of Isabel's birth, Richard had been knighted and was rising at court. Isabel would have had a typical upbringing for a young medieval noblewoman. An academic education was not hugely likely for Isabel or her sister, although the women of the Neville and Beauchamp families were known to be well educated, and therefore Isabel and Anne would have probably been taught to at least read, especially religious texts. Much more likely was an education centred on preparing the girls to become mistresses of their own households after marriage, dancing, court etiquette, possibly musical instruments, and preparing them for marriage. The main issue we have with both Isabel and Anne, as well as their mother, is that their lives were lived in the shadow of the men around them, and while they would no doubt have stamped their authority in their own way, they simply don't enter the legal documents or records of the time unless they were once again affected by men, such as becoming a widow or getting married. This means there is a lack of evidence that could tell us much about what kind of person Isabel was, and so we can only construct the context of the world she inhabited. Much of this revolves around the actions of her father, her later husband, and their parts in the Wars of the Roses. By the time of her birth, the country had been in near constant struggle with France, and the wars had decimated the economics of England, as well as causing conflict within the court itself, as Henry VI's queen, Margaret of Anjou, was herself French. To add to this, Henry VI was an ineffective ruler, mostly due to his mysterious illness that sank him deep into catatonic states throughout much of his reign. This allowed a power vacuum to creep in, fought over by Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and Richard Plantagenet, the Duke of York, who were rivals. Many other noble families had rivalries going with each other, including the Nevilles themselves, who quarrelled with the Percys of Northumberland. But in 1454, Richard briefly managed to claim power for himself as the leader of a regency council, and this worked in the Nevilles' favour for a while. Richard Neville backed Richard Plantagenet, who was his brother-in-law, and in return he was granted the position of Chancellor, pitting him directly against Henry Percy, Duke of Northumberland. However, in 1455, King Henry recovered long enough to reverse York's charges, remove him from office, and reinstate Somerset in his place. These events kicked off the Wars of the Roses in their most vicious peak when Isabel was only 4 years old. Richard of York led a revolt against the king on the 22nd of May 1455, leading a force of between 3,000 to 7,000 men towards London, met by Henry's smaller force of just 2,000. Unsurprisingly, it was a victory for the Yorkists. And to top off their victory, they also wiped out many of their rivals from the House of Lancaster. This left them in charge of the king as they captured him, as well as holding the reins within government. But how did this play out for the Neville family? Richard was given the strategic position of Captain of Calais, and he led several anti-piracy operations in the English Channel that made Richard of York's position even stronger. Warwick quickly rose to become one of the chief protectors of the Yorkist regime, both in Parliament and militarily, especially as Calais was also the garrison for England's largest standing army. Margaret quite rightly, considered Warwick to be a threat to the throne after recent events, and she managed to cut off his supplies. But an attack on the English seaport of Sandwich in Kent raised fears of a French invasion. The Queen had no choice but to once again supply Richard with what he needed in order to protect the country. In October 1460, after more fighting, Richard of York put his hand on the king's throne in an act of usurpation, clearly stating that he thought the throne was his. It's now thought likely Warwick knew about this beforehand, but many were obviously not very happy about it. A compromise was reached in which Henry VI could stay on the throne until he died, but instead of his son inheriting, Richard of York would instead. Obviously, nobody was happy with this in-between situation, and so more fighting broke out between the two houses. York died at the Battle of Wakefield on the 30th of December that year, along with his second son Edmund, leaving his eldest son Edward to carry on his claim. Warwick sided with Edward, and they hurried to London. On the 4th of March 1461, Edward was declared King of England as Edward IV, and Henry and Margaret fled to Scotland with their young son, also called Edward. Richard Neville was confirmed in his post as Captain of Calais, and after inheriting his father's possessions and being rewarded by the king for his service to him and Richard of York, Warwick now became one of the wealthiest men in the kingdom. Isabel was now 10 years old and would have had an upbringing that went between the family stronghold of Warwick Castle, her father's favourite castle in the north, Midland Castle, and Calais. Edward's younger brother Richard, later to become Richard III, stayed at Midland Castle when he was younger as Warwick's ward, and it's likely both Isabel and Anne met him and spent time with him. Increasingly, however, Edward and Warwick began to fall out, and when the king married Elizabeth Woodville against the advice of Neville, it caused an irrevocable rift. Richard Neville lost some of his power and influence after this point, and he stayed away from court more often. However, he was still in favour with Edward, as seen through the fact his brother was promoted to Archbishop of York, and Warwick escorted Henry VI to the Tower when he was recaptured. But in 1466, Warwick was sent out to France and Burgundy to start marriage negotiations for Edward's sister, Margaret of York. On the surface, this seems pretty good, except that Edward's new father-in-law, Richard Woodville, Earl Rivers, favoured a Burgundian marriage, and the king was being much more influenced by Rivers at this point. A secret marriage agreement was signed between Charles the Bold of Burgundy and Edward, leaving Warwick to carry on what were essentially fake negotiations with France. All along, Warwick had also preferred a French connection, and so this only added salt to the wound. Sometime in 1467, Isabel appears briefly in the record as a 16-year-old eligible for marriage. We have no way of knowing what her feelings on this may have been, but it's likely her parents prepared her for a high-ranking marriage. Warwick asked the king if his younger brother, George, Duke of Clarence, could marry Isabel, but Edward refused. The main reason for this seems to have been Earl Rivers' reluctance to consider giving the Nevilles any further power, especially as there were rumours they were leaning towards the House of Lancaster now, and he took over the dominant position at court. Richard was openly furious about the rejection, and he began to plot against Edward. Others were growing discontented with Edward's reign as well, and so the time was ripe for revolt. Up in his Yorkshire stronghold, Warwick orchestrated a rebellion in April 1469, and part of this was to befriend George, possibly with a view to placing him on the throne instead of his brother. George was at this time 19 years old and had much of Edward's leadership qualities and determination, but he was also overambitious and prone to violence. The rebellion was suppressed, but in July, Warwick and George travelled over to Calais, where they were met by Isabel and her mother Margaret. Here, George and Isabel were secretly married on the 11th of July in the Église Notre-Dame de Calais in Calais. For Warwick, his daughter was linked to England's ruling family, and for Clarence, he gained a wife who was the heiress to a vast fortune. For Isabel, there was also the slight possibility she might one day become queen, if George did overthrow his brother. We cannot sadly know how she felt about her new husband, but there is some evidence to show Clarence cared about his new wife. which may have been made more intimate by the fact they could have met as children, as with Richard III. We also know that George had no mistresses or illegitimate children during his marriage. George also had his own quarrels with his brother, however. The young couple went to France with Warwick, who had now deserted Edward in favour of Henry VI's queen, Margaret of Anjou, who had become the centre of the Lancastrian cause. George at first also joined him, but it soon became clear that Neville was not that invested in making him king, and was soon drawing up plans for his other daughter Anne to marry Margaret's son Prince Edward, and help the boy become king instead. Henry did try to soften the blow for George by stating he could be next in line after his own son, however. Isabel was also pregnant at this time, and it can't have been comfortable travelling during that period, especially in the 15th century. She was moored up on a ship just outside Calais when she went into labour, sometime around the 17th of April 1470, but sadly she gave birth to a stillborn child. We don't even know if the child was a boy or a girl, as there are conflicting reports that it was an unnamed boy and by others that it was a girl named Anne. It must have been a sad event either way for their first child. But by December of that year, George had had enough when his father-in-law went through with the wedding of his daughter Anne to Prince Edward. George quickly realised he was never likely to become king with Warwick's help, and he returned to England with Isabel by his side, begging forgiveness from his brother Edward and switching once again. This must have been difficult for Isabel in many ways, as she had previously always travelled with her family in one form or another, and now not only was she travelling alone with her husband, but it was in opposition to her father. 2 months previously, in September, Clarence had already received letters from his brother promising reconciliation if George returned to the fold. A few months later, in April 1471, Warwick was killed at the Battle of Barnet, with Clarence fighting alongside his brothers. Richard Neville's body was displayed for 3 days at St. Paul's to rid any rumours he had survived, before Edward allowed the body to be buried in the family vault at Bisham Abbey. For Isabel, her sister Anne, and their mother Anne Beauchamp, it must have been a devastating loss. Not only had they lost a father and husband, but their family lands were forfeited to the crown as well. However, Isabel did slightly better out of it, as George was, alongside his brother Richard, given several of the offices Warwick had held. George was also given the title of Earl of Warwick through his wife, but this was far from a simple matter. By 1472, Anne Neville had become a young widow, and at first she stayed with her sister and brother-in-law. There are few sources for this period in the sisters' lives, but it is interesting that it was the first time they interacted and were not under parental influence. According to the Crowland Chronicle, which is not known as the most reliable source, George was determined to steal away the Neville lands for himself, and he disguised Anne as a kitchen maid. Even though George probably would have wanted all the lands for himself, after all his wife was the eldest sister, it's highly unlikely he would have been successful at hiding the noblewoman Anne Neville away as a kitchen maid, or would have even attempted it. Sadly, we once again have little evidence for what the two sisters thought of each other or the events around them, and fictional accounts present Isabel as a woman plotting against her sister alongside her husband. But it's probable they enjoyed spending time together, and it would have been comforting for them to have one another considering all that had happened. Whatever the case, an argument then ensued between George and his brother Richard, who wanted to marry Anne. It was almost certainly to strengthen his suit for the Warwick estates, same as his brother, and George refused the match, knowing it would possibly weaken his own. Eventually, however, an agreement was made between the two men that Richard would quietly renounce his claim to many of the Warwick lands and estates, and he and Anne were eventually married sometime between 1472 and 1474. In 1474, Parliament ruled that the two sisters would inherit equally, setting aside the claims of their cousin George Neville and even their own mother. We again don't know how Isabel and Anne felt about this decision, as their voices simply haven't made it to the historical record. Isabel fell pregnant once again and gave birth to her first surviving child on the 14th of August 1473, a daughter named Margaret. This little girl would go on to become Margaret Pole, a woman who would spend her life being treated with suspicion by the later Tudor regime due purely to her family name. This was followed by a little boy born on the 25th of February 1475 named Edward. He would become the centre of plots against Henry VII, even if he had no part in them, and had a tragically short life after much of it would be spent imprisoned purely because of the threat he represented to the Tudor crown. It's not known how Isabel and George were as parents, but considering Margaret and Edward later seemed to have had a strong sibling bond, and we know that George cared deeply about Isabel, we can assume they likely were affectionate parents. Isabel would have one more child, a young boy born on the 5th of October 1476 named Richard after George's brother. Sadly, this little boy would live only a few months, dying on the 1st of January 1477. But sadly, he wouldn't be the only one who would pass away. On the 22nd of December 1476, Isabel herself died at the age of 25 from what we now consider was likely to be a puerperal fever from childbirth or possibly consumption. Her body was placed in Tewkesbury Abbey, where not long after her husband George would also be interred. And the story could end here, except that her death created yet another tragic event. We know two things for certain about George. He cared deeply for his wife, and he tended to resort to violence when there was conflict. He eventually jumped to the wacky conclusion of Isabel having been poisoned, and decided it was one of her ladies-in-waiting, Anchoret Twinho. On Saturday, the 22nd of April 1477, poor Anchoret was interrupted in her own home by a visit from George, along with several men in his employ, at around 2 in the afternoon. She was dragged out unceremoniously and taken to Bath to be imprisoned. On the Sunday, she was then taken to various other places, ending up at Warwick Castle on the Monday at around 8 p.m. Anchoret was now 70 miles from her home. She had only the money and jewels she had been carrying on her person at the time, and these were taken from her. This was a real attempt to disorientate her and remove her from stability in order to get what George wanted. He went further than this, and when Anchoret's daughter and son-in-law travelled with their servants to meet their mother, he refused them and made them instead lodge at Stratford-upon-Avon. The following day, she was brought to the Guildhall at Warwick before a hastily arranged jury of justices of the peace. The jury clearly did not wish to partake in what was going to be a sham trial, but they were threatened into staying by Clarence. The jurors would later say they had deep regret over being part of it, and several of them would ask Anchoret for forgiveness after her sentence. George claimed she had given Isabel a drink of ale mixed with poison, and Anchoret was found guilty with absolutely no evidence at all to prove any of it. She was taken immediately from there to the local jail, and from there to the gallows, only 3 hours or so after her sentence was given. Poor Anchoret was hanged on nothing more than the say-so of Clarence, with no evidence at all for the supposed murder of Isabel. It's sad that the biggest record we have involving Isabel is that of what is almost absolutely a false accusation of murder surrounding her tragic death. George and Edward's relationship continued to deteriorate, and this incident was just one of many that would lead to his brother the king eventually ordering his execution on the 18th of February 1478. Anchoret's grandson was given a pardon on behalf of his grandmother in the same year, and young Margaret and Edward, only 4 and 2 respectively, would go to live with their aunt Anne Neville. We sadly know very little of Isabel's life, and instead her story, much like that of her sister Anne, highlights the place of noblewomen in the 15th century. While there are some exceptions, most noblewomen lived their lives through the lenses of fathers, brothers, husbands, uncles, and male cousins. Although Isabel's name and fortune could have meant in a different era she would have been a powerful woman in her own right, the limitations of her age instead turned her into little more than a pawn. She was cared for, and she seems to have had something of a comfortable life, if we consider that much of her short life was lived in the shadow of war. Isabel was probably content in having made a good marriage and become a mother, the two primary targets for what a woman could achieve in the medieval period. There are no glimpses even of what she was like as a person. While we could assume her marrying George because her father willed it even against the wishes of the king suggests she did as she was told and submitted to the men in her life, this doesn't actually show whether there were disagreements or arguments about these events. Nothing shows us if she was a woman who loved dancing, if she preferred sewing or liked reading, what her feelings on religion were, and again, this is to be expected for when she lived. We can say that Isabel was significant in the arguments around the Wars of the Roses, and that her existence was pivotal, as was Anne's, for what happened to George and his brother Richard with regards to their brother and staying in his favour. The importance of Isabel's family name would carry on into her two children, Margaret and Edward, and would shape their lives as well. We can only hope that in Isabel's short life she was able to find some happiness, and that at least parts of her existence did not always revolve around the plans of the men around her. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.